don't give you labeled figures, that really defeats the purpose of the whole thing. When you're going over all these images and your terms, the best way.
Yeah.
Can you share your screen with us, please?
What was I saying? These images right here, right? Your term list as well as the images, right? Are what we're kind of looking over and looking at a couple of the features, right? So for all of them, you're going to want to look at all the views. Some of these are like the colored ones. They're just put there, like ones like these aren't really going to be on the test if there's not like a bunch of things next to them for the most part. They're just to kind of help you orient yourself and maybe, take a look at this as well as the uncolored ones, right? Just to kind of find some of your features that may not be so obvious otherwise, right? So like when you look in the inside the skull over here, right, you can see that this eye socket, the orbit over here is made up a bunch of these different bones, right? And some of your stuff on your lab is asking you where's the orbital surface of your frontal bone, your sphenoid bone, your maxilla, and your zygomatic, et cetera, et cetera. So these are useful and just kind of orient yourself for that. But for what's going to be on the practical, you could just imagine that it's going to be something like this, and there'll be like a what is A, what feature is it A, what feature is it B, right? Or maybe there'll be a tag over here, right? What bone is at C right there, right? So there's bones that you have to know, and your skull and your facial bones make up a certain amount of bones, but then there's those features on a bone, holes, bumps, grooves, like indents, stuff like that, processes, that is like projections of the bone that you also have to know, right? So as you go down these, you want to do it in a systematic kind of way, right? And so on this bone, on this picture, like looking from the front, you will go to your list over here, and you're looking at the frontal view, which has, you could have like a bunch of bones there, but you're going to want to find, frontal bone. What do I got to know on the frontal bone there? Right, frontal sinus, well, I can't see that. Here's the supraorbital notch, right? And that's going to be on this picture, like right over here, right? That's your supraorbital notch or foramen, depending on what you look at, right? So the first thing you're going to want to do is recognize that this is the frontal bone over here. And your frontal bone is part of your skull bones, which we'll go over how to name those in a second. But then you got all these facial bones over here that you could see. And, there's dumb ways to remember all this. And the dumber it is, the better it is how you're going to remember it, right? It's best to make up your own, but you could look up online. How do I remember? What's a mnemonic for facial bones, right? And you'll come up with some dumb thing like this. Virgil can not make my pet zebra laugh. You'll want to relate each of these letters just to remind you, okay, how am I going to go over this in a systematic way and label them, right? And then you'll find your vomer. It's kind of back over here somewhere. Your vomer. And then you're going to find your inferior nasal conchi, inferior nasal conchi for C. Not for your nasal bones. Over here, nasal. Make is maxilla. Maxilla. Or if you want to make it the mandible, your jawbone basically. P is for palatine bone, which you can't see. It's back over here at the very back. It's making up the last part of the roof of your mouth. Palatine bone. And what else? Palatine, zygomatic, right? For your zygomatic bone. Sorry. And then your lacrimal bones, which you can barely see. That's not what this arrow is pointing to, by the way. There they are over there. Your lacrimal bones. And all these are All these are paired with the exception of your mandible. Right? So you have a left and right maxilla, left and right zygomatic. Well, your palatine is kind of fused together back there. So those are some of the bones that you want to know. Just some way to memorize everything. I'm just going to look at the chat here. Somebody's asking about the superior orbital fissure or the superior orbital fissure or the supraorbital foramen. This thing right back here is a part where like your eye, your nerves and your blood vessels and stuff are going through the back of your eye socket. That's the superior orbital fissure back here. And then this is the supraorbital notch or foramen, depending on, sometimes it's just like a little bit of a notch on the back of the eye, up on top of the eye there. So that is like a front view of the skull, right? And then this is that internal one where you have those sinuses. This is just a cartoon picture of those, the maxillary sinuses over here. These are the sphenoid sinuses, which are kind of sitting farther back really. And then your ethmoid sinuses within your ethmoid bone and your frontal sinuses up here. Right? There's just these big spaces within your inside, like the skull bones themselves, right? So over here in green, those ethmoid sinuses over here. These are the maxillary sinuses. These are eye sockets over here. These are just different pictures, right? Your maxillary sinuses over here. This is your inferior nasal conchae. This is makes up your septum. The bottom part is made up, the top part is made up by your part of your ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate. And that also has your middle nasal conchae right over here. And then the vomer is going to make up the bottom portion, your nasal septum, which may also not be on your list. But I think your perpendicular plate is, as well as your vomer. So, and it's just another X-ray picture of those sinuses here. And here's another one, right? Frontal sinus. Oh, here's the ethmoid sinus. And then this side view right here, this is part of your ethmoid bone. You can't see the sinuses, but you can see the perpendicular plate over here. That's that part that we just looked at on the top right over here from the side. And then this is another part of your ethmoid bone called the Christi galli. All right, so that's the front view and then a couple of inside view. This is the side view. Again, these are the different skull bones over here that you could see. You can almost see them all, but you definitely want to be able to recognize them on your intact skull, the uncolored, right, black and white skull. The first thing you'll do just to get yourself learning all the names of the bones is learn one of those dumb mnemonic things, right? And you can do the occipital and the parietal and the frontal and the temporal. And inside the eye socket, you can see this is mostly an internal bone, but you can see a little bit of the ethmoid bone over here, and then the sphenoid bone. And so all these are all connected by these like sutures right over here, right? Some of those sutures you got to know, right? The coronal suture, the squamous suture, the lambdoid suture. Now, the way I remember this one is old people from Texas eat spiders. Right? So that's how you can remember these skull bones. Right? So those are the bones of the skull. And then you also have those features like other bumps and holes and stuff like that. And things like your zygomatic arch, which is made up by the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Right, so that the process is this like jutting out piece over here. And that meets up with the temporal, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, right? Zygomatic process of the temporal bone, right? And together they make up the zygomatic arch. Right? That's right above your jaw right there, right? That's just a couple of names. When you see the word process, like right over here, the condylar process of the mandible over here, or the coronoid process over there, right? Those are like a kind of a projection of the bone, right? Big sort of lengthenings right here might be called a ramus, your mandibular ramus over here, right? So you got processes, you got ramuses, you might have an angle, right? Things like that. So here's another process right here. Right, this over here, this is part of your temporal bone, complicated bone. Here, this bump right over here is where your neck muscles attach, right? Your sternocleidomastoid muscle. That's your mastoid process right over here. And then this over here, this is your ear. And then that's where your ear canal goes in. This is called your external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus. And there's two meatuses, but they both mean some kind of opening or hole. I don't know why they call it a meatus. Mostly when you see a whole thing, it's going to be called a foramen or a canal, right? That means some kind of passageway or something. This is the supraorbital foramen. This is called the mental foramen for some reason. Well, because that's in the mental region. What did I miss? Sutures, right? Coronal suture. Remember, coronal means like a crown. You could think of like a little crown over here. There's also a sagittal suture going up the top. You can't see right here, connecting the right and left parietal bones. This suture right over here is called the squamous suture. This is called the lambdoid suture back over here. All right, so that's the side view. Now we're going to flip the skull and look down from an inferior view, like looking up at it, right? So we're looking up at the skull, or we've turned it over and we're looking down on it, however you want to think of it, right? We removed the mandible, right? The jawbone, which would be fitting into these little spaces over here, but you can't really see them. So this is color coded, right? So I put marks just on the bones themselves. I'm not sure if you have the, this bone over here is part of the maxilla. And then this yellow one over here is the palatine bone. And then right behind it is the vomer, which is going to extend up in the nasal cavity to make up part of your nasal septum. But that's the bottom part of it. And then this kind of juts into your sphenoid bone in purple. Over here, this is looking at from the bottom side right there. That connects kind of laterally with the temporal, very complex bone. Right over here, and then the temporal bone connects over here to the occipital. We could also see in blue the zygomatic. Remember that temporal process of the zygomatic bone meets up with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone to make up that zygomatic arch. And the temporal bone also has, here's a very bottom view of that mastoid process, as well as something called the styloid process. Right? So process meaning kind of extensions, right? You can kind of see how that name would come up over and over again. And then this big hole in the middle, right, is where your spinal cord enters the brain, becomes the brain stem, the foramen magnum. These little things right over here are where your skull rests on your C1, your top vertebrae, right on top of your neck right there. So that's where it articulates, it joins up with, called the occipital, because this is the occipital bone, condyle. Condyle is going to refer to a joint surface, right? So you'll see condyle come up in a couple of places as well. All right, this is just a close-up showing a couple of the holes that you got to know. Over here.
Yeah. Could you go back to last week for a second?
Would you just be looking for maxilla bone, or would it be something like palatine process of maxilla?
If palatine process is on your list, I might ask, what's the process? If I ask what the bone is, you'd say maxilla. If I ask you what the process, what the feature is, you'd see palatine process. The vomer too, the palatine, actually this part of the palatine is the maxilla process, right? It's, the maxilla process, right? So that's where they meet up, just like these make up the zygomatic arch. It's just the bones. I don't even think they're on your list. All right, and this is just a close-up of that with a couple of the holes. Right over here, you have, right over here, these two holes on the left and right. This is where your carotid artery enters the skull. Over here, bringing the blood supply, or a big part of your blood supply, to your head and your brain. And then this is where your jugular vein leaves, right? So this is the jugular foramen. Over here, this is the carotid canal. And notice that the carotid is entirely within your temporal bone, right? And whereas your jugular is made up by like two like half arches of your occipital and your temporal bone right there. Right, so it's kind of merged. And then you have your external acoustic meatus on the outside. All right, so this is a picture without it being colored, right? Those same things. All right, your maxilla, your palatine bone. Here's your carotid again, and jugular. Your jugular again is made up, let's see, by, this is your occipital bone over here, and this part is part of your temporal. Oops, it goes all the way out over here. Right? This is part of your temporal bone, right? So it's made up of the two. Right, so your jugular, again, is leaving your jugular vein, leaving out that jugular foramen, and your carotid arteries are entering the brain through your carotid canals. And then the other things visible here, remember your condylar process of your mandible, that where it makes up your jaw joint? It was sitting right in this little fossa, which means like a depression or an indent of the bone. Right, so this is your mandibular fossa, where that process is sitting, making up the jawbone. And then back here is that mastoid process where your neck muscles, one of your big major neck muscles are going. This is just a close-up of the same thing. I labeled an extra one here, those occipital condyles right there. Again, this is where your C1, your most superior vertebrae, these are going to rest on that vertebrae right there. If they're going to articulate, remember condyle means something like joint surface. And then now, this is looking from, if you flip the skull over, you're looking down on it. This is the inferior view. Now we've cut the skull open and we're looking down inside the skull from a superior view. Right? We can see here's the sphenoid bone, the temporal bone, right? The occipital bone. And so from this side, I mentioned before, this is where the sella turcica, this is where your pituitary gland is sitting, right? It means the hypothalamus must be right up here somewhere in the actual brain, right? So your pituitary gland is sitting here, and your jugular is over here. Again, remember, made up by the temporal and the occipital bone, right? Leaving all draining the blood, draining the brain of blood over here. And remember the hole on the other side, the carotid canal was right next to it. But the carotid canal goes up, actually, and kind of goes a little bit over here. So it's actually coming out the other side of the temporal bone, of this little ridge right here. Right, so they're a little bit farther away from each other than they were on the inferior view, because the carotid canal kind of goes up the side.
So it's that top arrow pointing out the carotid canal.
Yeah. Is that was your question?
Yeah. And then is the bottom one the internal acoustic meatus?
And then this one, which is on this ridge right here, if we remember the external one, right? It was like, that was coming from your ear over there. This is basically where all your inner ear structure is, right? All those little ear bones and your ear apparatus thing. This is your internal acoustic meatus over here. It's on this ridge of the temporal bone called the petrous portion, which I think is on your list as well.
On our list, it says Stella tertius, I can't pronounce it, but
Yeah.
hypophyseal fossa. I was
Right.
just curious, do those two always go together? Or should we
No, it's the
differentiate them?
I never call it that so much. It's not bad to know, but Sella turcica is fine. Sella turcica, however you pronounce it, is fine. That's where the pituitary gland sits right here. It's the same thing. Fossa is like a indent. That's basically where that is. And this is just another view looking down on the skull, right? Your frontal, your ethmoid, your sphenoid, your temporal in brown here, your occipital in blue, and then you can see a little bit of the parietal up here. Right? So over here, I have a couple of things labeled, a couple of features that are a little harder to distinguish, on the other bones sometimes. So this again is the sphenoid in red. Right? It's kind of a centerpiece bone that's connecting, you notice, like to the ethmoid, to the frontal, to the temporal. It's basically connecting to all your other skull bones. But there's a couple features on it, like your lesser wings. Right? It looks kind of like a bat right here. These are like the bat ears of the lesser wings. Over here, the greater wings will be down here. I'm not sure if that's on your list or I put it on another picture. And then the temporal bone in brown has two regions to it. You have your petrous portion, and that had that internal acoustic meatus, as well as your carotid canals coming off. They're not really visible here, and they merge with this other hole that you don't have to know. But your squamous portion, flat, remember that squamous suture was on the top. Squamous means flat, the flat portion of the temporal bone, and this petrous portion where your internal ear structures are. And this is just kind of just picture. You don't have to know so many holes, but just why are all these holes here, right? You have your brain stem coming up here. All your cranial nerves are coming off the brain stem and they're going up and innervating your face and stuff, right? So there's your internal acoustic meatus, your auditory nerve, as well as a couple other nerves that are like going into that space right there. This is a red background. This is just, in case you're wondering. So, that if they mean something in some sense, right? That's why we're learning these. Right. So this is just I think I just put this as an overview, and then the close-up over here, we have this region. Right, this, you can't really see the sutures, but the ethmoid bone, right, is that centerpiece. This is the frontal. This is the ethmoid bone. And on the ethmoid bone, you had a couple features like your cristae galli, right, which is in the middle. It's kind of a projection. And then these holes right here, this flat portion here is called the cribriform plate. You could also call it the olfactory foramina. I'm not sure what I can't remember exactly what it is on your list, but either of those will work. That's where your your olfactory nerves, okay, go from your brain and they dangle down into your nasal cavity down over here. That's what those holes are for. And then you have your sphenoid bone again, right, which consists of this upper portion. Over here, these are the lesser wings up here. And then over here, these are your greater wings portion of it. Lesser wings, greater wings, and then again, the sella turcica or hypophyseal fossa. This is the posterior portion. Again, we had the jugular foramen over here and the carotid canal up here coming out the other side. Remember, just look at the difference between what it looks like from the inferior and superior versions. They're a little bit closer to each other. Here you can't really see, but that's the internal acoustic meatus. Here's another picture of a similar thing. Crystal galli, cribriform plate, lesser wings, greater wings, sella turcica. You also have your optic canal. Anybody check if that's on it? I believe it should be.
I don't think it is.
No, optic canal isn't? Okay. All right. Well, and I know that the foramen lacermen isn't on. So this one does have a couple of stuff that I don't want to cross this out in case it is, but if you don't have to know it, then you can just cross those out. This is a mistake one. These are ones that my poor anatomy students have to know, but you don't. All right, but greater wings, lesser wings, greater wings. You have the petrous portion over here, this ridge of the temporal bone. And then this is the carotid canal over here, sella turcica, foramen magnum, big hole. All right, now this is a disarticulated sphenoid. And this is one of the two bones that you'd actually have to know from the skull disarticulated. Everything else will be on the articulated, on the intact skull. Right? But sometimes it's easier to actually see these disarticulated, right? As long as you can get what view you're looking at. Right here, this is the sella turcica. This is the lesser wings, the greater wings. So we're looking down on it from above, right? We're looking down on it and seeing those features. So this is the sphenoid and those are those features. And then this is looking at it. It's removed. This is looking through the eye socket, right? That's the back of the eyeball. There's that superior orbital fissure that you don't have to know about. But these are the lesser wings of it. This over here is the sphenoid sinus. And then over here, which you could see not so clearly in most pictures, but if you look at the inferior view of the skull, you'll see these pterygoid processes. Right over here, see how you can barely see these over here, but these things are these right here are the pterygoid processes. It says your sphenoid sinus, lesser wings. And then this is the other bone that you'd have to know, disarticulated. And what you have here is that Christi Galli. You have the ethmoid, the cribriform plate. You have the perpendicular plate, right? That's making up the top half of your septum of your nose. And then you have your middle nasal conchae, right? Your inferior nasal conchae is down there. That's a separate bone. Right? But these other nasal conchae right over here, these are your turbinates, right? This is what, when you breathe in air, your air is circulating all around these things. And then I should say, okay, there's one more disarticulated, but again, it's more for ease than anything else. We have the mandibular arch right here, angle over here where there's that obvious bend that you could feel on your own self right there just by feeling the bottom of your jaw. You have that condylar process that was going in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. And you have the coronoid process over here, right? It looks like a shark's fin. Condylar, coronoid. And then you have these little holes, the mental foramen. And then inside the mandible right here, you have the mandibular foramen. And also on your list, you have the alveolar processes right around here. I didn't label them, and I'm going to say don't worry about those. Alveolar process, they're just where your teeth fit in. And I don't know if anywhere in there I'm asking about fontanelles or not, right? Baby skulls. We'll talk a little bit about this for formation, but when your bones are growing, there's places where they haven't fused yet, right? The bones are still growing out. You have this soft spot at the top of your head when you're born. Right? Those are called fontanelles, right? And then you have the frontal suture, which actually fuses up in most people. So you have a single frontal bone, but when you're born, they're still not fully fused. All right, so that really will do it. I went over the skull.
I have a question. On our list under other cranial bones, it lists the hyoid bone, and I was curious where that would be
It would be
in these pictures.
I think I forgot. You know what? I don't have that one. So, but it would be. It's a single bone that's actually sitting right about up here or so, and it's not articulating with anyone else. Yeah. So that does it for your skull, and then the rest of your axial skeleton is your vertebral column and your rib cage. And what you want to know about the rib cage, you have your sternum over here, which is made up by 3 individual bones that are fused together. So these are actually individual bones, or you can also call them regions since they're pretty much fused. This top part is the manubrium, on the top. This is the body over here. And then this is the xiphoid process, this little part over here. Right? If you ever done like CPR stuff, right? This is where you place your 2 fingers, right? When you're trying to locate where you should be putting your hands to pump, to do those chest compressions. Xiphoid process. That's your sternum. And then your sternum, right, has these ribs attached to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? And you don't have, all you have to know is that these first 7 are called true ribs, right? Because this one, goes to here. This one goes to here. So all these ribs are actually attached directly to the sternum. So these other ones, right, are kind of attached to rib 7, right, 8 and 9. And 10 are just attached to number 7. So these are false ribs, right, which are also these bottom ones, but the bottom ones are also called floating ribs because they're not actually attached to the sternum at all. They're just floating in the back there. Okay, so those are ribs, and just distinguish between true, false, and floating, right? 1 through 7, true. False is actually 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, but 11, 12 are also called floating ribs. That's all you got to know about the rib cage. All right, now we get to our vertebral column. This is just a picture of the intact vertebral column. And this is where your skull, in fact, they have the last bit of the skull right here. And then you go down, and then it's going to attach at the inferior portion. It's going to attach over here to your 2 left and right hip bones over here, right? This will be your vertebral column, right? And so for these, you have 3 distinct, well, actually 5 distinct regions, but 2 of them, the sacrum and coccyx, are pretty easy. Right? Within the actual vertebral column up here, before you get to your sacrum, you're going to be dividing it into your cervical, right? That's the top portion, right about here. From here, your thoracic. Okay, which will be about here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And down about here. And this is where your ribs will attach on these thoracic vertebrae. And then you got your lower ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This might have been 1. I might have counted these wrong, but there's 5 lumbar. Okay. And I wouldn't ask you something like that per se. We'll look at the individual vertebrae, right? But that's how they're stacked up together, these different regions of your vertebral column, right? All right, so when you look at these individual vertebrae, right, either from a kind of lateral view or looking down on it, superior view, or from the posterior view, right, you're going to want to be able to distinguish the different types of vertebrae. You don't have to distinguish thoracic vertebrae number 7 from thoracic vertebrae number 10. You just have to distinguish thoracic vertebrae from a cervical vertebrae and a thoracic vertebrae from a lumbar vertebrae. And so there's a couple of distinguishing marks on these. These top ones right here, your cervical, these are thoracic, these are your lumbar, right? Lateral, looking down over here. And so for your cervical vertebrae, they're very easy to distinguish because you got these little holes right over here. Right, these are called your transverse foramen. This is basically, you have these arteries running up the side right over here, going up your neck right here. And so that's what they're for, right? And none of the other ones have your transverse foramen. They all have your vertebral canal. This is where your spinal cord goes down. Right, you'll notice your spinal cord is much thicker at the top, and then it kind of dwindles down it tapers down at the bottom. And so that's the easiest way to tell your cervical vertebrae. They're the only ones that have the hole. Some of them also have this bifurcated spinous process over here where it splits in two. Not all your cervical vertebrae have those, but if they have it, they're definitely a cervical vertebrae. And then the other things are kind of hard to distinguish from these pictures. A couple other ones. All right, so these are a couple of your thoracic vertebrae. And what we're looking at here, I just want to show you this articulated ones where they're joined up next to each other. Notice they got these, each vertebrae, this is vertebrae 1. And then this is vertebrae 2. Each one has this little arch over here, and then together they make up these holes, right, called the intervertebral foramen. Right, that's where your spinal nerves are coming out of. Right, so this is a side view. Coming off the side right here, you have a what's called a transverse process. Right, transverse, right, going out the side and then going out the back. Right, something you could feel if you reach around the back of your neck, you feel that bump. That's the C7. That's your spinous process of C7. So these are called the spinous process, sticking out the back. These ones going out to the side are called the transverse processes. Right, this is just another side view of down by your lumbar vertebrae. You have those intervertebral foramen, right, where your spinal nerves are coming up, your spinous process going out the back. And also in between the body or the centrum of your vertebrae, you have these discs, right? Those fibrocartilage pads called the intervertebral discs. Right? And those are for compression, right? So that when your spine is, it's kind of like a shock absorber in between the vertebrae. So just for those, all these features, right? This is 2 vertebrae. And we mentioned there was these transverse processes. We had the spinous process. Spinous process. It's gonna get messy over here. And then we have what are called the articulating process, right? And then at the end of those articulating process, you're going to have a joint surface called the articular facets. And you're going to have one at the top called the superior. And we're just going to go with the facet one so you can have less processes to remember. Articular facets. Facets means a joint surface, right? That's right, kind of over here. The inferior ones are going to be at the bottom right over here. Articular facets. Inferior AF. What does that sound like? All right, so superior articulating facets and inferior articulating facets, right? And when we looked at those stacked together, bad picture, right? We'll notice that the superior articulating facet of this one meets up with the inferior articulating facet of the one below it. That's how they join up together, right? And then this inferior articulating facet would meet up with the vertebrae of the one below it. All right, so the reason I'm showing you this picture is you'll notice that these superior articulating facets of this one are kind of facing inward. They're facing inward. And that means they'll kind of be a tight interlocking with the ones above it. This one over here is kind of facing outward, right? This articulating facet. And this is the dead giveaway to tell you which one is a lumbar and which one is a thoracic vertebrae. Because the thoracic vertebrae have these superior articulating facets facing straight out. All these features are things you want to know on any vertebrae right there. Okay, that you would have to know these kind of features. We're just going to look at a couple of distinct ones, right? This is your cervical vertebrae. Again, this C1 is going to rest on the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. That'll be this one over here, right? And so those first 2 vertebrae are the only ones you actually have to know by name, right? That is your, C1 is your atlas. Remember Atlas, he's holding the world on his head. Well, this is holding your head on your neck, Right, these are the superior articulating facets which the occipital condyles rest, right? Because it's a cervical vertebrae. Here are those transverse foramen. And under it, you have C2, which is your axis. Right? That's your axis. And then the axis has a couple, well, this is the spinous process. So this is the posterior side over here. And then this bump over here, you'll see this referred to as the dens or odontic process. This is just basically a modified vertebral body, right? And in real life, you would have like ligaments spanning over here. This is how your neck, basically you can shake no back and forth, your head back and no, because it kind of spins around this dens right here. All right, so that's C1 and C2. And here is another picture of that. All right, and so here's that, what you just said here, the bifurcated spinous process that kind of splits in the back right here. We got the transverse foramen, right, going down the side. You have the superior articulating facet on top right over here. And that's all I'm asking right here, I guess. Next, we're going down to your thoracic vertebrae, right? Here's a bunch of them stacked together. And you notice for, the more middle, especially ones of your thoracic vertebrae, the spinous process is like really pronouncedly like going down like this, right? So the spinous, that's one way to kind of tell your thoracic vertebrae. And then, these are two connected right here. And this is your intervertebral foramen. Thinking of the intervertebral discs as well, right? Those fibrocartilage bad, this is signifying a slip disc, right? And those intervertebral foramen, this is where your nerves are coming out. This is nothing. This is just for your own interest. All right, so now we're down to our thoracic vertebrae, and we got a couple features over here. You got the superior articulating facets over here. You got the spinous process, so those are the superior, that's the spinous process, transverse process. This is the pedicle. Well, actually, that's marking the superior articulating facets again. And this is your vertebral foramen. There's things like a lamina over here, a pedicle, and the body, right, that are on your list. But if they're not starred, then I'd say don't worry about them. I should have put them on there. But
Is there a difference between the superior articular facet and the superior articular process, or is that the same thing?
the process is where it juts out, and then the surface, like, so this is the facet, and this is kind of like the process, right? But if you wrote either of them on a blank thing, you'd be fine for me. But yeah, the facet is at the end of the articulating process. That's basically it. So a facet means like a joint surface. Process means like a projection. Okay, that's your, thoracic, right? Kind of looks like a giraffe a little bit. You got those superior articulating facets facing straight out. And then this is a lumbar, which is a little more clunky looking, looks a little bit like a moose. Right? You got the spinous process, thick spinous process. Here's the body of the vertebrae right here. This is your inferior articulating process or facet. This is your superior one. Notice over here it's kind of curved inward. Right? Your superior articulating facet. That's a dead giveaway for your lumbar vertebrae. All right, and then you come to your sacrum. All right, your sacrum, this is a fused. These used to be separated and then they fused. Right, those are your intervertebral foramen, now called the sacral foramen, foramina, where the spinal nerves come out. You just have a base and an apex over here that I think are on your list, but otherwise it's the sacrum. And then your little vestigial type of tailbone over here, the coccyx over there, another bone that's fused together. All right, so I think I went over every single darn image right there of your axial skeleton. So once you've gone through all those, go through your term list for your axial skeleton, all the bones, all the features, then you could start kind of looking either at the list or at the videos, and we'll go over on next Tuesday. We'll walk through the appendicular. I'll go through them a little bit on Thursday, but otherwise we'll go over the full thing on next Tuesday.